Nobody remembers the exact moment before it happens. That's what survivors always say. One second you're writing notes in the margin of a textbook, wondering if you remembered to pack your lunch, thinking about the exam at the end of the week. And then the sound arrives. A sound that doesn't belong in a classroom. A sound that every cell in your body recognizes before your brain has time to translate it. And the world divides, permanently and irrevocably, into before and after. March 12th, 2026. Constant Hall, Old Dominion University, Norfolk, Virginia. Mid-morning, students sitting in rows, a professor at the front of the room. The ordinary, unremarkable architecture of a college education unfolding exactly as it should. And then, gunshots, the screaming, the crash of chairs overturning, the bodies pressing toward exits, toward windows, toward anywhere that wasn't here. One person would not walk out of that building alive, and the story of why begins not in Norfolk and not in 2026, but a decade earlier, in a federal sting operation that should have been the end of something. Instead, it was only the beginning. Old Dominion University sits in the heart of Norfolk, Virginia, a port city with a proud military heritage, a working waterfront, and a skyline shaped equally by naval installations and university buildings. ODU, as it's known to the tens of thousands of students who call it home, is a public research university with over 20,000 enrolled students, a place where first-generation college students sit alongside graduate researchers, where engineering students share campus space with nursing majors and education students and future teachers. The campus has a particular energy, the hustle of a commuter school blended with the ambition of a research institution, a place that serves students who work nights and take morning classes, students who are the first in their families to go to college, students who came from across the country and across the world for what ODU offered them. Constant Hall is one of the older buildings on campus, a familiar landmark for students who have passed through it for decades, one of those institutional buildings that accumulates the quiet history of thousands of lectures, thousands of exams, thousands of conversations in its hallways. On the morning of March 12th, classes were in session as they always were. Students had found their seats. Bags were unzipped, laptops were opened, notebooks were flipped to fresh pages. It was a Wednesday. The week was halfway done. Spring was approaching, that particular brightness that comes back to a college campus after winter. The feeling that the hardest part is almost over, that warmer days are coming, that the semester is beginning its slow turn toward its end. No one walking into Constant Hall that morning had any reason to believe anything other than that this would be an ordinary Wednesday. Mohammed Baylor Jallo was 36 years old. He walked into that classroom carrying a weapon and a decade's worth of history that most of the people around him knew nothing about. What happened next unfolded in the terrible compressed time of violence. Seconds stretching into something enormous, something that would take investigators months to fully reconstruct, but that survivors would replay in their minds for the rest of their lives in a matter of moments. Jallo opened fire inside the classroom. The sound of the first shot shattered the ordinary Wednesday. Students scrambled, chairs scraped and toppled. People dove below desks, pressed themselves against walls, rushed for doors. The training that universities have had to adopt in the years since mass shootings became a regular feature of American life, the run, hide, fight protocols that no one should ever have to use, that feel abstract and almost insulting when practiced in a calm room, suddenly became the only operating system available. One person was killed. 2 others were injured in the attack. In the compressed horror of a classroom shooting, the difference between one dead and many dead often comes down to seconds, to angles, to the position of a body relative to a door. And in Constant Hall on March 12th, it also came down to something else, something that would define the story of that morning as much as the violence itself. In the chaos of an active shooting, the textbook says to run if you can, hide if you can't run, and fight only as a last resort when your life depends on it. Fighting an armed attacker is presented as the option of absolute last resort. Dangerous, desperate, likely to end badly. The calculus is grim. Most people, in most situations, will choose to flee or to hide. But in that classroom at Constant Hall, some students made a different choice. According to reports that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the attack, a group of students confronted Mohammed Baylor Jallow. In the middle of the shooting, in the presence of a man with a gun and the willingness to use it, they moved toward him rather than away. They subdued him. They stopped him. The details of exactly what happened, who moved first, what was said, how the physical confrontation unfolded, would take investigators time to fully establish, but the outcome was clear. The shooter was restrained before law enforcement arrived on the scene. And that intervention, that extraordinary act of collective courage in the most terrifying moment imaginable, almost certainly saved lives. The students who had come to Constant Hall that morning to learn something from a professor walked out of that building having taught the rest of us something about the capacity for bravery that lives inside ordinary people. When police arrived, they encountered Jallow at the scene. During the law enforcement response, he was killed. The shooting was over. The investigation was just beginning. And what investigators found when they began pulling on the threads of Mohammed Baylor Jallow's past would raise questions that went far beyond the campus of Old Dominion University. His name was Mohammed Baylor Jallow, 36 years old, a former member of the United States Army National Guard, a man who had served, who had taken an oath, who had been trusted with the training and responsibilities that come with military service. On the surface, a biography that fits a certain American archetype, the immigrant or son of immigrants who enlists, who serves, who tries to build something within the institutions of the country that has given him a home. But the surface was not the whole story, not even close. To understand what brought Jallow to Constant Hall on March 12, 2026, you have to go back 10 years, back to 2016, back to an undercover FBI investigation that, by every measure, should have functioned as a permanent ending. In July of 2016, federal agents arrested Mohammed Baylor Jallow. He was 26 years old. The FBI had been watching him. The investigation that led to his arrest was the kind of patient, methodical counterterrorism work that rarely makes headlines until the moment it results in an arrest. Months of monitoring, undercover interactions, the slow and careful construction of a case designed to hold up in court. What the investigation revealed was deeply alarming. Jallow had attempted to purchase an AK-47. He had done so in the context of discussions that made his intentions unmistakable. He wanted to carry out an attack. And the model he reportedly cited, the blueprint he had in mind, was the 2009 Fort Hood massacre, the day an Army psychiatrist named Nidal Hassan opened fire on fellow soldiers at a Texas military base, killing 13 people and wounding more than 30 others. Hassan had been motivated by an ideology of jihadist violence. Jallow, the investigation suggested, shared that framework. The FBI had stopped him. They had built the case. They had made the arrest. And now the full force of the federal justice system would come to bear on a man who had expressed the desire and taken concrete steps toward committing an act of mass violence in the name of a terrorist organization. In October of 2016, Mohammed Baylor Jallow pleaded guilty. The charge was attempting to provide material support to ISIS, the Islamic State, the self-proclaimed caliphate that had, by 2016, established itself as the defining terrorist threat of the era, inspiring attacks around the world, recruiting followers across the globe, and claiming responsibility for atrocities committed on multiple continents. Pleading guilty to material support of a designated terrorist organization is not a minor matter. It carries significant weight, legally, morally, practically. It is an acknowledgement of intent, an acknowledgement of alignment with an ideology of mass murder. And in 2017, a federal judge sentenced Mohammed Baylor Jallow accordingly, 11 years in federal prison, followed by a period of supervised release. At the time, the sentence was reported as part of a broader pattern of ISIS-related prosecutions in the United States. Dozens of cases in which the FBI had identified individuals who had been radicalized, who had expressed the desire to commit violence, and who had been arrested before they could act. Jallow's case fit that pattern. He had been caught, he had been convicted, he had been sentenced. The system, it seemed, had worked. 11 years, plus supervised release. For most people paying attention to the story in 2017, that felt like a conclusion. The threat had been identified, neutralized, and processed through the justice system. Whatever Jallo had intended to do, he would not be doing it for a long time. By the time he saw the outside of a federal prison, the world would be different. He would be different. That, at least, was the theory. Federal records indicate that Mohammed Baylor Jallo was no longer in federal custody as of December 2024. That is the sentence that stops you cold. That is the sentence that demands you read it again. Not 2028, when an 11-year sentence handed down in 2017 would have been fully served. December the 2024. Less than 8 years after his sentencing, less than 9 years after his guilty plea, less than a decade after the FBI had stopped him from buying a weapon to carry out a mass shooting. There are mechanisms within the federal prison system that can result in release before a sentence is fully served. Good behavior credits, compassionate release, sentence modifications. These mechanisms exist for reasons. The prison system is overcrowded. People change. The law recognizes the possibility of rehabilitation. These are not inherently unreasonable principles. But in the case of a man who had pleaded guilty to attempting to provide material support to ISIS, a man who had discussed, explicitly, his desire to carry out a massacre modeled on one of the deadliest mass shootings in American military history, a man whose radicalization had been deep enough to prompt an extended federal undercover investigation. What did the monitoring look like after he was released? What did supervised release actually mean in practice? What safeguards were in place? These are questions that investigators, lawmakers, and the families of the victims at Old Dominion University would spend the weeks and months after March 12, 2026, demanding answers to. They are questions for which satisfying answers would be hard to come by, because the gap between December 2024 and March 12, 2026, 15 months of freedom, was the gap in which everything went wrong. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and local and state law enforcement descended on Norfolk and began the work of piecing together a picture of those 15 months. Who had Jallo been in contact with? What had he been doing? Had anyone noticed anything that suggested he was on a trajectory toward violence? Had the terms of his supervised release been enforced? Had he been in touch with anyone connected to extremist networks? The questions multiplied faster than the answers could. But certain facts were already clear. A man with a terrorism conviction, a man who had, in the language of his own guilty plea, attempted to provide material support to a designated terrorist organization, had been released from federal custody. He had re-entered society. And 15 months later, he had walked into a classroom at Old Dominion University with a gun and used it. Old Dominion University itself had done what universities do. It had issued a lockdown alert as quickly as it could once shots were reported. Law enforcement had responded with urgency. The campus had protocols, and those protocols had been activated. But protocols are designed for the moment violence begins. They are not, by definition, designed to prevent the circumstances that create it. The question of how Jallo had obtained the weapon he used in the attack would become a critical thread in the investigation. Federal law prohibits convicted felons from possessing firearms. A terrorism conviction adds additional layers of restriction. How does a man in that legal situation walk into a classroom with a gun? The answer to that question matters, not just for understanding what happened at ODU, but for understanding the vulnerabilities that allowed it to happen. In the days that followed, Norfolk grieved. Old Dominion University grieved. The family of the person who was killed in Constant Hall grieved in the particular devastating way that families grieve when someone they love is taken by violence, with disbelief, with rage, with the crushing weight of a loss that has no logic to it, no fairness, no meaning that could ever make it acceptable. The two people who had been injured fought their way through recovery. The students who had witnessed the shooting, who had hidden under desks or run through corridors or pressed against walls waiting for police to arrive, began the long, non-linear process of trying to make sense of what they had seen and heard. Trauma doesn't announce its arrival on a schedule. It shows up later, sideways, in ways that are hard to anticipate. And the students who had subdued Jallo, who had, in the most literal possible sense, put their bodies between a gunman and their classmates, became the subject of a gratitude so enormous it was difficult to articulate. University officials would call them heroes. Law enforcement would describe their actions as the likely difference between one death and many. The word hero gets used easily and often in the aftermath of tragedy. In this case, it was not a reach, it was simply accurate. In Washington, the attack at Old Dominion University immediately reignited a debate that has been burning since the first ISIS-inspired prosecution in the United States. What happens after the sentence ends? The federal government has invested enormous resources in identifying and prosecuting individuals who attempt to support or carry out acts of terrorism. The FBI's counterterrorism division has, by any reasonable measure, prevented attacks that would have claimed many lives. The record of successful prosecution is real. The system, in many cases, works. But prosecution and sentencing are not the end of the story. They are, in some ways, only the middle, because sentences end. People are released. And the question of what happens to a radicalized individual after they have served their time, whether de-radicalization is real, whether supervised release is meaningful, whether the conditions that produced radicalization in the first place have been addressed, is a question that the American justice system has not fully answered. Jalloh's case raised it with particular urgency, because this was not a man whose radicalization had been ambiguous or disputed. He had pleaded guilty. He had acknowledged his intentions. He had been inside the federal system for years, years during which, in theory, he could have been monitored, assessed, evaluated. And yet something had gone wrong. Whether it was the conditions of his release, the quality of his supervision, the resources available to those responsible for monitoring him, or something deeper and harder to address. Something had broken down between December 2024 and March 12, 2026. Senators and representatives called for hearings. The Department of Justice was asked to provide a full accounting of Jalloh's release, supervision, and the circumstances that had preceded the attack. Counterterrorism experts went on television and radio to discuss the known recidivism data for terrorism-related offenses and what it suggested about the need for more rigorous post-release monitoring. None of it brought back the person who had died in Constant Hall. None of it healed the two people who had been wounded. But it was at least a reckoning with a system that had, in this case, failed. There is a specific kind of grief that attaches itself to cases like this one. It is the grief of the preventable, the grief that asks, repeatedly, insistently, without ever arriving at a satisfying answer, what if? What if the sentence had been longer? What if supervised release had meant something different in practice? What if someone, somewhere, had noticed something in those 15 months and intervened before a man with a gun walked into a classroom? The victims of Mohammed Baylor Jalloh did not deserve what happened to them. The students who survived carry something now that they did not carry before. The staff and faculty of Old Dominion University will look at Constant Hall differently for the rest of their professional lives. Norfolk, a city that has known loss before and has always found a way to rebuild, will add March 12, 2026 to the permanent record of its grief. But the city will also remember what happened in that classroom before the police arrived. The students who made an impossible choice and chose to fight. Who looked at a man with a gun and moved toward him instead of away. Who, in the most terrifying moment of their lives, decided that if this was the last resort, then the last resort was what they had. That is not a story about policy or systems or the failures of federal supervision. That is a story about the irreducible capacity of human beings to protect each other when everything else has broken down. The investigation into the Old Dominion University shooting will take months to complete. The questions it raises, about how Jalloh obtained his weapon, about the nature and effectiveness of his supervised release, about what more could have been done in the years between his 2017 sentencing and March 12, 2026, will be the subject of official reviews, congressional hearings, and journalism for years to come. Those answers matter. They owe it to the dead to find them. But here is what we know tonight. One person is gone. Taken in a classroom on a Wednesday morning when they had come to learn, to grow, to build a life. Two others carry the physical and psychological marks of what happened to them. And in the midst of it all, a group of students did something that most of us hope we will never be called upon to do. They stood between a gunman and their classmates. And the people behind them came home. Somewhere in Norfolk tonight, a family is missing someone they should not be missing. And in the same city, families who almost lost someone are holding on a little tighter, to their children, to their spouses, to the particular and fragile gift of another ordinary day. The system that was supposed to stop Mohammed Baylor Jallow the first time did its job. The system that was supposed to stop him from becoming a threat again did not. And the people who ultimately did stop him were not federal agents or prison administrators or policymakers. They were students in a classroom on a Wednesday morning, doing the impossible thing. That is where this story ends. And it is, perhaps, where the harder conversation begins.